Egypt has turned into a totalitarian state. The human rights situation is catastrophic. People have to realize what it means. Firstly, it means that Egypt is ruled by an unelected military regime. The 2018 elections were a parody, with a total lack of accountability towards Egyptians. There's no real opposition and no genuine public debate at all. Then it means that everything you say or do that might be slightly negative about Egypt, the government, or whatever Sisi and the military want to control can be turned against you in the most violent and definitive way. Regularly, the parliament extends the emergency law so that the president and the military are granted with more and new repressive powers. Journalists, lawyers, human rights activists, leftists, liberals, Muslim Brotherhood, children, everyone is targeted and muzzled in Egypt today. Typically, with the COVID-19 pandemic, medical staff who have dared to speak and to complain about the lack of equipment have been arrested. Today, more than 60,000 human beings are detained for political reasons in atrocious conditions. Among them, elderly, sick people, children. All of this is very well documented by NGOs, including the use of torture and the abuse of pretrial detentions prolonged forever. I'm unfortunately only covering a tiny portion of all the human rights violations that have been committed in Egypt for the last years. There is so much to say about the enforced disappearances, about Sinai, and about the lack of justice for the victims. The conditions of detentions of the detainees are inhuman. A few days ago, Amnesty International released a new report which describes how the prisoners are denied everything a normal human being would need to live. Even during the pandemic, the cells are overcrowded with about 1.1 square meter on average per prisoner. I now ask you to pause for a minute and to visualize what it actually means to live and sleep in 1 square meter for years. The prisoners are under and malnourished. Their lack of fresh air and light, and the cells are squalid, and they're denied access to proper health care. People must understand that in these conditions of detention, every prisoner is at risk of developing serious and permanently debilitating health issues. But among the prisoners, some are even more vulnerable due to their age or their poor health conditions. What is the point in keeping a 62-year-old human rights defender with blood pressure and newly developed kidney failure in pretrial detention for more than 2 years? More than 7,000 prisoners are over 60 and 1,500 are known to be very sick. They pose no security threat at all. By releasing them, Sisi could easily give a sign of humanity and goodwill to the world. Awarding the Légion d'honneur to Abdel Fattah el-Sisi was utterly insulting, disgraceful, and really, really unnecessary from President Macron. On top of it, the ceremony was kept secret, and French media actually found about the Légion d'honneur award through the Egyptian presidency website. President Macron knew it would not look great, and he tried to hide it. This is really dishonoring. And I want to pay my respect to Corrado Gias and other intellectuals from Italy who returned their Légion d'honneur in protest. The French government has chosen to believe, or at least to pretend to believe, to Sisi's narrative about stability and the fight against terrorism, even though it's obviously a lie. This is not about stability. This is about control, power, and greed. France wants to sell arms. Sisi and his partners have bought billions of weapons, and this is enough for the French government to close their eyes on the human rights situation, even though it is a big mistake, both morally, of course, but also practically, as I explain later. Of course, the privileged relationship with Egypt comes also under the scope of bigger strategic choices in the region, where the stakes are not always directly related to Egypt itself. But I think it's not only a matter of arms or big industrial business stakes. For decades, France has happily swallowed the strongman narrative maintained by Mubarak and Ben Ali in Tunisia, and all the variations of this narrative, including all the alleged threat posed by political Islam. During these years, France did not even try to know more about the opposition and the dissidents to these regimes. Today, France acts as if the 2011-2013 period was an aberration, and that Sisi was a mere successor of Mubarak. But France fails to grasp that Egypt is basically on the verge of chaos, and that Sisi's regime is not a reliable partner, that it is deeply unstable, and that despite the apparent failure of the Arab Spring, the dreams of democracy have not vanished at all, and this was just the beginning of a long process that will take years. I know many French academics have tried to show that to the French government and to tell them how wrong and short-sighted the stability narrative is, but they have not been heard, obviously. And I know that also that many French diplomats are very disheartened by the decisions that have been made in the recent years. Finally, it seems to me that the human rights and the rule of law are not very trendy at the moment in the French public opinion. And I think that in terms of foreign affairs, the stability narrative is actually strongly established in the public opinion as well in France. France and the EU do bear great responsibility for the human rights violation in Egypt. Firstly, they're responsible through their passivity as strategic partners. In so many occasions, France and the EU could have reacted to the successive waves of repression of the regime, but they didn't. Given how much Egypt needs the EU and the European countries, they do have the levers to put pressure on the regime to stop this repression, or at least to alleviate it. But they've chosen to be passive, and this silence does make them accomplices to the regime. Although the EU Parliament has been fantastic and has adopted strong-worded resolutions, the executive side of the EU has failed to garner the political will to change things. Despite what the EU keeps saying to human rights advocates, they won't change things by whispering words of disagreement in the backstage of meetings with their Egyptian counterparts, while still agreeing to great partnership deals and loans and grants without conditioning them to tangible improvements on the human rights front and also on the democratic front. But most importantly, by selling arms to Sisi that he has used against Egyptian civilians, whether in Sinai or during demonstrations or as surveillance tools against dissidents, Europeans and French have enabled this repression. They have made it happen. France has actually become a champion of repression in Egypt. Renault trucks, armored vehicles, have been used against peaceful demonstrators in Egypt, and French companies have provided the regime with technologies used to spy on its own population and to arrest human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, LGBT people, writers, etc. I do believe that the change of US administration will bring a relief to the human rights situation in Egypt. During his campaign, Joe Biden was highly critical of Sisi's dictatorship, and we can only hope that him and the new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, will be true to their words. No blank checks for dictators, as Biden put it, might mean that the US aid to Egypt will finally be conditioned to real improvements on the human rights side, and I hope also on the democracy promotion side. And I do hope that many political prisoners will be released through this influence. But human rights are not restricted to the well-being of political prisoners. Of course, progress on that front would be more than welcomed, but there should not be any political prisoners in the first place. The fight against corruption, the independence of the judiciary, freedom of expression, democracy are all components of human rights, and they must be part of the influence game. This question is essential. I believe that the moral duty humans have to each other should be enough to find the human rights situation revolting. Knowing that French-made armored vehicles have been used against peaceful demonstrations should be enough to forbid the export of arms to Egypt. Knowing that the first and only democratically elected president of a country has died out of medical neglect after years in solitary confinement should be enough to obviously not giving La Légion d'honneur to the ruler of this country. Knowing that children and their mothers and their brothers are forcibly disappeared, detained with adults and tortured on a routine basis should be enough to actually put all our weight to make it stop. But the usual answer to human rights advocates is that Egypt is a strategic partner in the region and in the fight against terrorism. That the EU and others have too many strategic interests to risk democracy down there. I think that this strategy is extremely short-sighted and irresponsible towards the European population. The regime is everything but stable. Mass repression is at the core of the regime's survival. That means this is not sustainable. The economic and social situation is way, way worse than in 2011. The poverty rate has grown by more than 20%, the debt has tripled, the private sector is bleak, and the military controls most of the economy, and they don't do it well, especially because they're so driven by corruption. The difference with 2011 is that Sisi has destroyed the political forces, political and social forces that were able to sort of channel the revolution into something sort of constructive. I think that Egypt is actually on the brink of chaos. Extremism is fueled by the repression, and some prison cells have turned into actual ISIS recruitment centers. In Sinai, civilians are under constant attacks and harassment from both insurgents, the militia, and the army without any perspective of justice. And the core issues the country faces, such as water scarcity, are still left unaddressed. Egypt has 100 million inhabitants, many of whom might be left with no choice but to flee if things turn wrong. They wouldn't go to Libya or to Israel. They would go to Europe. I can't believe that the current situation can persist much longer. It is urgent that the EU, France, Germany, Italy, and the US reconsider their position with Egypt's regime.